The invitation was lying in the mailbox. Oleg noticed the corner of the envelope already from the entrance to the building, but until the very last moment, he tried to convince himself not to believe it. It was hard not to notice the envelope. The inappropriately cheerful orange color stood out against the official green of the mailboxes. But the contrast between the color of the envelope and the emotions it caused was even brighter. Inside Oleg, it felt as if someone had set a puddle of kerosene on fire. It was a feeling similar to suddenly noticing a cockroach on the wall, disgust turning into exhausting fear. Oleg had changed 3 apartments in 2 months. He was deliberately covering his tracks, getting into conflicts with landlords, and ending up on blacklists of real estate agents. At some point he had realized that he would not survive another spectacle, at least not in a sane state of mind. However, the invitation still found him. And it all started about a year ago. Oleg, coming out of yet another Tinder date, was standing under the roof of the metro vestibule and smoking, glad that this time the girl seemed to be interested. She was not even bothered by the fact that Oleg filled awkward pauses with stupid jokes and funny observations about other cafe visitors. When Oleg got nervous, he became talkative. 2 people approached him. "Do you want to see the spectacle?" An unshaven, slightly puffy man in a strange-looking hat said flatly, wearing a jacket that looked dirty already at the production stage. Oleg drew in air, ready to blurt out his usual "no money, fuck off." But the man's companion, in sharp contrast to him, quite good-looking, shoved a gaudy orange envelope into Oleg's hands. And Oleg made a chain of mistakes, probably the longest and stupidest in his 28 years of life. He took the envelope, did not throw it into the nearest trash can, then even opened it and read the text typed in bright, cheerful letters. Spectacle, visit to see, to experience pleasure. Enjoy the spectacle, get pleasure, visit. The program included performances on stage by everyone who, the meaningless and jugglers. Below was an address, not far from the center. The text was printed over caricature clowns, and for some reason, doctors. Both looked very sloppy. They reminded Oleg of unicorns and dinosaurs from cheap cereal boxes. Those were also clearly drawn at the last moment, and as they say, done without care, without soul. Only there was something wrong with the eyes of these clowns and doctors. Looking closer, Oleg realized both eyes on each of them were left eyes, as if someone had cloned one eye and pasted it over the other in Photoshop. And then Oleg made his biggest mistake of all, the crown of all his previous mistakes, past and, as he often thought later, future ones. He went to the address listed. He would like to say that he was driven there by compulsion, by a mysterious voice in his head, but Oleg did not want to lie to himself. Boredom brought him to his first spectacle in life. He was very surprised to see a line of silent people stretching to an unremarkable door at the end of the building. Oleg took his place at the back and was about to ask who was last, then maybe joke about who is the edge. But something in the behavior of the line unsettled him. There was an inappropriate solemnity in these people. All of them stood straight, and some of them, or did it seem so, were licking their lips. And also, for some reason, no one said a single word. After showing the invitation to the indifferent cloakroom guard, who clearly did not give a damn, Oleg entered the building. In the same solemn silence, Oleg handed his jacket to a cloakroom attendant who was vaguely similar to the guard and to that greasy-jacketed guy who had dragged Oleg into all of this. Then, following the flow of the crowd, Oleg entered the hall, already quite full of people. So are the seats assigned here, or is it first come, first served? Oleg tried to lighten the mood. It did not work. Silent spectators kept arriving. The stage was blocked by a curtain, and what would happen there was still unclear. Oleg had to sit in the middle of the row. The crowd pressing from behind gave him an unpleasant feeling, like standing at the threshold of a room where you just turned off the light. Staying in place felt wrong. Nonsense, Oleg thought. If anything, I will leave during intermission. There is an intermission here, right? And if not, then it means I will not have to sit for long. Then the curtain opened, and the speakers, standing at the edges of the stage, played a few notes. After that, completely unmusical sounds began to come from them, as if specially chosen to cause discomfort. The notorious spectacle began. For the first few minutes, Oleg was confused. What was happening on stage was so absurd that it caused nothing but a nervous smirk. It became especially funny when several cages with small animals were ceremoniously brought onto the stage. Apparently this was something significant, because the cacophony that had been playing until that moment suddenly changed into something resembling a march. All of this seemed funny and inappropriately pompous to Oleg. He quietly snickered, then turned to gauge the reaction of the others. Maybe he was missing something. Or would they laugh too? No one was laughing. Everyone sat in grave silence, staring at the stage without looking away. Everyone except a few of the nearest spectators, those who, by Oleg's estimate, could have heard his snicker. They were looking straight at him with anger and something like fear. Oleg realized that he had ended up somewhere very wrong and decided to pretend that he too was very interested in what was happening on stage. Oleg barely remembered what was happening there. He stopped watching, or pretending to watch, at the moment when the last of the brought-in chickens had its head twisted off. Even what he did see, he did not properly remember. Someone was hysterically laughing. A naked person smeared with something very unpleasant was hitting himself on the head with a stick. What was happening deeper on the stage, Oleg noticed only in passing, and immediately looked away, realizing that seeing and remembering it was not worth it even before his brain had run the image through its perception filters. Instead of watching the stage, Oleg secretly watched the people around him. All of them, without exception, were looking at the stage. The hall was fairly dark, and it was hard to make out details. But it seemed to Oleg that all the spectators were watching the stage with the liveliest interest, their gazes literally glued to the macabre taking place there, and no thoughts were reflected on their faces. I probably look the same right now, if you do not look closely, Oleg thought. The longer the performance went on, the more Oleg was consumed by an unpleasant feeling of anxiety mixed with confusion. And what, he thought, would happen at the end? What if they bring us onto the stage? And everyone will be happy about it too. For some reason, that outcome seemed the most terrifying. But no. When the lights in the hall suddenly turned on, Oleg simply stood up and, carried along by the silent wave of spectators, left the hall. The action on stage did not even think of stopping, but Oleg felt that he no longer had to watch and exhaled. Now he would not have to find out what would happen to the unfortunate sheep, and how exactly the multi-pion contraption that was just being dragged onto the stage would be applied to it. After what had already been done to it, anything seemed like a release. Oleg did not remember how he picked up his things in the cloakroom, how he went out, or how he got home. Only one fragment remained clearly in his memory. He looks back and sees one of the spectators stating, "Dear, I will be late at work. They held me up." As if it were about a banal affair, Oleg thought, and not about this. Since then, invitations began arriving at Oleg's home. Oleg did not want to think about how they found out, or rather kept finding out, no matter how much he tried to hide his address. Just as he did not want to think about what would happen if he refused the invitation. And with dull submission, he went to the spectacle. Thankfully, it took up literally one evening every couple of months. Well, and a couple of years of life, judging by how it felt. But such abstract things, Oleg reassured himself, you cannot touch with your hands. It did not sound very convincing. Among themselves, the spectacles differed like patients in a mental hospital. Some were outrageously cruel, others were simply phantasmagorical and absurd. Some were meaninglessly tedious, and others even almost beautiful. However, all of them were, continuing the analogy, wrong, broken, provoking a stream of rejection rising from the depths of consciousness. Oleg soon understood that it was not necessary to watch with wide open eyes. The main thing was not to show that what was happening on stage caused you anything other than interest. At some point, he even became almost bored. He began to look at the other spectators, and he noticed something. It seemed he was not the only one experiencing inappropriate emotions from watching the spectacle. Some people lost control of their facial expressions, and Oleg saw their lips tremble, an eye twitch. Some bit and licked their lips, clearly experiencing anxiety that way. Several times Oleg was ready to swear that he had identified a newcomer in their little club of losers. That girl smiled too eagerly. That elderly man in the third row had too glassy a stare. Sometimes optimism betrayed Oleg. It began to seem that he was just calming himself, that he simply did not want to admit that he was the only one here, not feeling any special joy. In such periods, Oleg often felt that the spectators were not looking at the stage, but at him, that after the spectacle, someone was following him home. At times an intrusive, morning-choking fear arose. What if next time Oleg himself would be forced to go on stage? But by evening it passed. A mass of semi-convincing arguments appeared, with which Oleg managed to drown out the monotonous, panicked tolling in his head. And so, having gone through bargaining and anger, being on the final stretch toward the stage of acceptance, Oleg decided to make one more attempt to avoid the intrusive invitation to the spectacle by changing several apartments. It did not help. Oleg took the envelope, not with horror and not with disgust, but with tired, inactive hatred. Oleg was almost ready to sink into dull despair. Come what may. The only thing that held him back was the memory of the guy who left the spectacle. This happened several sessions ago. A young guy, clearly an intellectual. Oleg noticed him even before entering the hall. The intellectual was clearly not in his element, that is, even compared to the others. He looked nervous and frightened, constantly looking around, trying to catch the eyes of spectators who were actively avoiding him. He tried to impose eye contact on Oleg too. Oleg had to shamefully pretend that he had nothing to do with this, and was just a walking mannequin. After entering the hall, Oleg again caught sight of the uncertain first-timer. On the stage that day, as if specially for the newcomer, they were putting on an especially meaningless, cruel, and murky performance. Oleg, with a now habitual effort of will, defocused his vision and concentrated on his inner voice. This trick helped slightly muffle the incoming sound as well, though not as effectively as the visual. From time to time, Oleg glanced around, checking the behavior of the other spectators. Everyone was stupidly staring at the stage, radiating or pretending to radiate deep interest. And suddenly, Oleg noticed something terrifying. The intellectual young man stood up from his seat. It was so wild that in the first second, Oleg did not even feel surprised. His subconscious simply could not find the right pattern to react to something like that. After a couple of seconds of running through options, maybe this is part of the spectacle. They added immersion. Bastards. Or am I starting to glitch? Oleg was forced to admit the obvious. The newcomer had really stood up and was already leaving the hall. There was still the same confusion on his face, but together with it, determination. He was leaving as if not fully grasping the horror unfolding on the stage, not applying to himself the whole ominous wrongness of what was happening. Just like that. And Oleg was staying here to suffer. Oleg, of course, never saw that guy again. And now, trudging dejectedly to another session of the spectacle, he was thinking about the fate of the brave intellectual. Oleg's thoughts habitually jumped between two possible versions. Perhaps, and even most likely, the brave man soon suffered monstrous punishment from the organizers of the spectacle, proportional to the cruelty and inhumanity of what was happening on the stage. What exactly that brave man went through, Oleg did not even want to imagine. But sometimes another, inappropriately optimistic thought flashed through Oleg's mind. What if the guy who left the spectacle, as they say, on a clear face simply left, took his jacket from the creepy cloakroom attendant, and the attendant did nothing to him, but with the same stone face handed over the outerwear, went outside, and the cloakroom twin of the guard only looked at his back without emotion. And now the lucky one is just living somewhere, telling his friends about a strange incident, with a touch of mysticism, like in that joke, "Do not eat the rabbit, he does not want to." This thought, in some sense, frightened Oleg even more than thoughts about the retribution prepared for the madman who left the spectacle. Does that mean you could have just stood up and left? Then why did Oleg not do that? And why did none of the spectators do it? They clearly did not like it. Oleg saw it. Or did he just make it all up? And he is the only normal person who somehow ended up at this gathering of cannibals. Thinking this way, Oleg himself did not notice how the time for the spectacle came. Several days flashed by before the marked date. The now familiar path of guard cloakroom attendant stage passed unnoticed. And there Oleg was, sitting in the hall, listening to the mournful howl of some disgusting wind instrument heralding the beginning of the spectacle, and thinking, "Now, I will stand up and leave. Stand up and leave. Just stand up and calmly walk out, and no one will do anything to me." Oleg repeated this mantra while the people around him sat either in horror or in anticipation. Oleg gripped the armrests and gathered his courage, preparing to stand